Okay, guys. Today I want to talk about bystander effect and why it's cope. So, in the year 2026, here in Canada, there's a lot of sexual assault cases, and there is a lot more people in public acting in erratic ways, which are highly risky and are further tearing the social fabric of our society, especially in major cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, etc. Now, I've been watching a lot of social media content lately that discusses this reality, and a lot of it involves women who are basically being assaulted, and they're complaining that the men in the vicinity are doing nothing to potentially basically curb or stop this behavior. So they're essentially just standing by and watching. And some people will cope and they'll say, oh, well, the reason they're not assisting this person who's being assaulted is because of bystander effect, right? It's like, oh, they're not doing anything because of bystander effect. Now, I want to contrast this with an example that I experienced in the 90s, which was the complete inverse of the bystander effect. And quite frankly, I was accustomed to this growing up, where the majority of people I was around, whether it was my neighborhood, my friends, family, again, as a 90s baby, we would always, not always, I'll take that back, but most of the time, people would stand up for others. When people needed help, they would assist others. People were more community oriented and cared about their fellow citizen. And so here's the example. I remember there was somebody who was walking on my street back and forth suspiciously, and I had a neighbor who was a police officer who was off duty, but again, he was one of the many people in my neighborhood who was highly concerned. And so he was attentively watching this person. Now, it turned out that this person was breaking into cars on the street and stealing. And so, although he didn't know that at the time, he was concerned about himself and his neighbors, and he was, not only was he willing to go out of his way to observe and see if there was a potential issue, but he was also willing to put his safety at risk. Turned out down the road, he found that he was trying to steal from cars. He was also trying to steal from his car, and so he ended up arresting him, and he called officers who were on duty, and they ended up taking him into the station. Now, the reason I bring this example up is because although this is one instance, I have many, many instances and situations where people stood up in situations where we weren't even needed, wasn't even a requirement. A really great example of this that comes to mind too is I used to work security at a large sporting venue, and there was a situation where there was a drunk, and now mind you, this drunk person was harassing people. And in particular, at this point in time, he was harassing my supervisor. And it wasn't necessarily at the point yet where things had gotten violent. And it wasn't so hostile that anyone needed to take a risk or to risk getting harmed. But I saw that this person, this belligerent drunk, was starting to posture himself in such a way that there was the possibility that he was going to get hostile with my supervisor, who was a smaller woman. Now, even though it hadn't gotten there yet, because of the culture and the social fabric I grew up in the 90s in Canada, I knew the smart thing as a man was to stand up for somebody who may be smaller in size. And so I basically positioned myself to him. And yes, I was security, but remember, like I said, it hadn't gotten there yet. But I still wanted to make it clear to this guy that, look, let's just de-escalate before things get worse. And long story short, he eventually did get more aggressive, even though at the time we weren't sure, but he did. And so I ended up throwing him out of the building, and I was willing to get violent, and I was willing to push him. And, I was willing to do more if it required, but there was no hesitation, right? And, this was just one example. There's other examples. I remember there was a time when I was working security at a nightclub, And when I was working security at the nightclub, same sort of situation. We had a dude who was basically harassing women, at the club. And again, it hadn't gotten there yet. He was like, let me put it this way. He was sort of in between the point of what would be considered harassing, but he was maybe a little bit, I guess you could say, below the threshold to where he had plausible deniability. But at this point in time, I had a coworker who was suspicious. And so he was keeping an eye on him. And then what ended up happening is he did cross the threshold, and it was getting to the point where he was being inappropriate. And so this security guard basically let me know, like, hey, this dude, it's a no-go. Like, his behavior is unacceptable. And so at that point in time, once he, gave me that clarification, I pretty much said, hey, you know what? Okay, let's do this. So I grabbed him. So actually, wait, first he started to grab him because as he was basically kind of like hinting to me that this was what was going, first he was speaking to me, but then he basically emphasized like, okay, dude, like he was giving me kind of like the look where it was like, this is no longer a maybe. This is this is for sure. So he basically put his hand on him, and then he was starting to push him out gently because he didn't want to fully escalate. But the person who was acting belligerent, he started to become more erratic. So I grabbed him, and then I basically pushed him and smashed his head on the divider of the door. And then after that, he was more dazed. And so then we further pushed him through the door. And then this way he was able to get out. And at that point in time, once we threw him out, the cops were there and they just took him off. And, these are some examples. I mean, I have so many, and it's making me laugh because as I'm going through this and I'm thinking about all these situations I've been through, I just laugh because, I grew up in a culture, in a society where, although it wasn't perfect, Canada in the 90s, it was very much the norm to look out for one another. And we were attentive. And I know some people are going to attempt to refute what I'm saying and say, oh, well, you were working a security job, and that's why you did what you did. Okay, well, here, I'll give another example. I remember a time where I was finishing a security shift. I was off security. I wasn't working as a security guard at this point, technically, because my shift had ended. And I was walking back to my car, and I didn't really, like, one of us had, I remember I was with somebody else, and I can't remember if he had something that visibly said security or I did, but one of us didn't and the other did. So she didn't technically know if he was walking me out or I was walking him out because we both finished our shift. And she was being belligerent, and she was, hurling curse words at everybody left, right, and center, and speaking to people in a demeaning and disrespectful way. And obviously she is a woman, so we're going to go easy on her and we're not going to do much. And at the end of the day, like, I wasn't planning on doing anything, violent, obviously, because like I said, she's a woman, she's a small woman. That was never a part of the plan. But it was the summertime. It was hot. The things she was saying were atrocious and just quite frankly inappropriate. And so, I kind of laughed about it. I kind of thought to myself, hey, it would be funny? It'd be really funny if I got a water bottle, allegedly, I'm just not saying this really happened. Maybe it's just a made up story for fun. And what if I just, doused the bottle on her and then we kind of just sped off, Now, mind you, it was hot and it wasn't really a big deal because at the end of the day, it truly was water in this theoretical story. And ultimately, it's not going to do any major harm or anything. It's not going to really do any harm. But at the same time, it kind of is a way of disciplining her because I could tell she was going around speaking to people that way and just yelling obscenities to random people, and nobody was doing anything. And so, well, I don't want to say nobody was doing anything because in all fairness, like, we just arrived, and I don't want to paint this picture that, we were the only ones doing something at the time. But anyways, long story short, I ended up, we ended up getting in the car, and then I got the water. We drove up to the right to where she was sitting, and I basically doused her in the water. She was shocked because she just thought she was going to get away because she was sitting at that corner hoping she could just keep basically bothering people. And then I emptied the water on her, and I did it quickly so she felt the splash, and then she was shocked. And then my buddy revved the engine, and then we just drove off. And I've given some examples of things that I've done to kind of stand up and, sort of speak against or act against people who are acting out of order. But, this rant is getting long, and I don't want to sort of extend this to such a long, period, because I do have other stories and situations of other people doing things. But I kind of want to conclude this video to just say that, growing up in that period of time, I wasn't the only person who was standing up when I saw injustice. And I wasn't the only person who was calling people out who were behaving poorly. Or if I saw somebody who was maybe a little bit too drunk and they were friendly, I would kind of ask them, hey, are you okay? Just because I don't know if, they are unstable or like they need some help or something's going wrong. And I saw other people do this too. And this was a lot more the norm. Whereas now what I see is people are being bothered and harassed in public, and others are just standing around doing nothing. And they're coping and they're saying, oh, well, the reason I'm not getting involved is because of bystander effect. And it's like, no, the reason you're not getting involved is because you're being cowardly. And we have an epidemic now where bravery is on the decline and cowardice is on the incline. And people are now using the fact that they're cowardly as an excuse to not assist others in need. And, seeing all these videos recently of women saying that they're basically being harassed and no one's doing anything to help them, that's just the thought that came to my mind. And like I said, this rant can get really long, so I'm going to stop it here. But it is very interesting to see how rapidly society has declined, especially here in Canada. I mean, Canada is now just a shell of its former self. And in many ways, I don't really consider this Canada. I would argue that the world we're living in right now in 2026 is not Canada, man. This is a new nation. This is a new world order project. And ever since 2015, when Stephen Harper, left the position of, prime minister, we've now have this, right? We now have this dystopian reality. Anyways, guys, if you enjoyed the rant, subscribe. Please let me know if this was enjoyable. I have a lot of stories, and I've been thinking, you know what? Why don't I just make this channel to discuss all the different, situations I've been in and some of the observations I've seen just living in this Canada 2.0. Anyways, guys, cheers.